They left a cadet alone in the canyon. He turned it into a killing zone. The order came fast, too fast for anyone to question it, too urgent for hesitation. Fall back! All units, fall back to secondary positions. The command echoed across the rocky terrain, carried on the wind and swallowed by the vast canyon behind them. Soldiers surged past Marcus Hale in a wave of motion, boots pounding against stone, gear clattering, voices overlapping in controlled chaos. No one stopped. No one looked back. There was no time for that. Marcus did. For just a moment, he turned his head and looked toward the canyon. It cut through the landscape like a wound. Steep, jagged walls of dark stone plunging into a narrow, winding passage below. Shadows pooled in its depths, shifting with the early light, hiding its true shape and depth. It wasn't just terrain. It was a choke point, a natural funnel, a place where numbers meant less, and positioning meant everything. "Cadet!" The voice snapped him back. Marcus turned sharply to see a lieutenant striding toward him, breathing hard. One side of his visor cracked and spiderwebbed from impact. "You're staying here," the officer said, gripping Marcus's shoulder with a firmness that left no room for argument. Marcus blinked, the words taking a second to land. "Sir?" The lieutenant's gaze flicked past him toward the distant ridgeline. Shapes were beginning to appear there, silhouettes against the pale light, moving with deliberate purpose. The enemy, too many of them. Far too many. "We need time," the lieutenant said, his voice lower now, but no less urgent. "Just enough for the rest of the unit to regroup and fortify the secondary line. 10 minutes, if you can manage it." Marcus followed his gaze again, eyes narrowing slightly as he studied the approaching figures. Advanced armor, tight formations, no hesitation in their advance. They weren't slowing down, they weren't afraid. "Yes, sir," Marcus replied, the words steady even as something tightened in his chest. The lieutenant hesitated for half a heartbeat, as if he wanted to say something more, something human, but the moment passed. He gave a single sharp nod, then turned and ran, disappearing into the retreating column. And just like that, Marcus was alone. The sounds of the retreat faded quickly, swallowed by distance and stone, leaving behind an eerie, oppressive quiet. Only the wind remained, whispering through the canyon walls, carrying with it the faint rattle of loose gravel. Marcus turned slowly, facing the canyon fully now. He took a few steps forward, boots crunching against scattered rock, his eyes scanning everything with a new kind of focus. The narrow entry point, the uneven ground, the fractured ledges that looked like they wouldn't take much to give way, the way the canyon twisted just enough to break line of sight every few dozen meters. And the sound, how even the smallest shift echoed and bounced unpredictably between the walls. He swallowed once, steadying his breathing. 10 minutes, he murmured under his breath. His grip tightened slightly on his weapon as he looked again, not just seeing the canyon now, but reading it, understanding it. The ledges weren't just unstable, they were opportunities. The narrow paths weren't just restrictive, they were funnels. The echoes weren't just noise, they were confusion. Something shifted in his expression then. The fear didn't disappear, but it changed, focused, sharpened. He exhaled slowly, the tension leaving his shoulders just enough for clarity to take its place. "Yeah," he said quietly. A faint, almost dangerous smile tugged at the corner of his mouth as his eyes tracked the enemy's approaching line once more. "I can work with that." Marcus didn't hesitate once the last echoes of the retreat had faded into the distance. The open ground behind him was no longer an option. Out there, he would be visible, predictable, and quickly overwhelmed. Without sparing it another glance, he turned and moved into the canyon, stepping into shadow as though crossing an invisible threshold between survival and certainty. Almost immediately, the air changed. The temperature dropped as the towering rock walls closed in on either side, shutting out the wind and muting the pale morning light. What little sunlight managed to reach the canyon floor did so in thin, fractured beams, leaving most of the path ahead draped in shifting shadow. The world beyond the canyon seemed to vanish, replaced by an enclosed, oppressive stillness where every small movement carried weight. Marcus slowed his pace, not out of fear, but intent. Each step was measured now, deliberate, his boots placed carefully to avoid loose gravel that might shift too loudly beneath his weight. His breathing steadied, his senses sharpening as he began to take in the terrain, not as scenery, but as a system of possibilities. He crouched beside a fractured section of rock, running his gloved hand along its surface. The stone shifted slightly under the pressure, not enough to collapse on its own, but enough to tell him what he needed to know. His gaze lifted, tracing the uneven line of the canyon wall until it settled on a narrow ledge above the path, where loose debris clung precariously to the edge. It wouldn't take much. A carefully placed shot, or a timed disturbance, and gravity would do the rest. Marcus studied it for another moment, committing the angle, the weight, the likely fall pattern to memory before rising and moving deeper into the canyon. Further in, the passage tightened, forcing the natural path into a sharp bend that swallowed visibility almost entirely. Beyond a few meters, the canyon twisted out of sight, creating a blind approach that no advancing force could easily read. That, too, was useful. Reaching into his pack, Marcus pulled free a length of cord, thin, durable, and flexible enough to work with quickly. He moved with growing confidence now, anchoring it low between two jagged outcroppings, adjusting the tension until it sat just high enough to catch an unwary step. Once it was secured, he scattered a handful of small stones and debris across the ground, blending the line into the natural clutter of the canyon floor. It wasn't meant to stop anyone outright. It didn't need to. All it had to do was disrupt movement for a fraction of a second to break rhythm, to force a misstep. And in a place like this, where sound carried strangely and space was limited, even the smallest disruption could cascade into something far more significant. Marcus straightened slowly, his head tilting as he listened. At first, there was only silence. The heavy, pressing quiet of the canyon, broken only by the faint tick of cooling rock and the occasional shift of loose gravel settling somewhere out of sight. Then, gradually, something else began to bleed into that silence. A distant rhythm. Faint, but unmistakable. Not the random movement of the environment, and not the whisper of wind slipping through the stone, but something structured, deliberate, coordinated. Footsteps. Marcus's gaze shifted instinctively toward the canyon entrance, now hidden from view by layers of rock and shadow. He couldn't see them yet, but he didn't need to. The cadence told him enough. They were disciplined, organized, advancing without hesitation. He exhaled slowly, letting the breath leave him in a controlled stream as his grip tightened just slightly on his weapon. The moment of waiting was over. Whatever happened next would be dictated not by orders, but by his own choices. Turning away from the sound, he moved deeper into the canyon, his mind already working ahead, mapping out the next position, the next advantage, the next opportunity to turn terrain into force. Behind him, unseen and unrecognized, the canyon lay in quiet anticipation, and somewhere beyond the bend, the first of the enemy scouts stepped forward, unaware that they were no longer advancing through open ground, but into something far more dangerous. They were stepping into a battlefield that had already chosen its side. The first of the enemy scouts entered the canyon without hesitation, their formation tight and disciplined as their boots struck the stone floor in a steady, synchronized rhythm that carried easily through the confined space. Their armor, sleek and angular in design, reflected what little light filtered down from above, while faint pulses of energy flickered across their visors as they continuously scanned the terrain ahead for threats. To them, the canyon was nothing more than an inconvenience of geography, a narrow passage that forced them to compress their advance temporarily, but posed no real danger to a force of their size and capability. Their instruments reported no significant resistance, no organized defensive presence, and certainly nothing that suggested more than a token delay. One human. That was all the data indicated, and one human, regardless of determination or desperation, did not constitute a meaningful threat. The lead scout adjusted their pace slightly as the canyon walls began to close in, raising a hand to signal a minor shift in spacing, though the overall advance never slowed. Behind them, more units filed into the passage, their numbers steadily increasing as they committed to the route, confident in both their superiority and the inevitability of their progress. What they failed to account for was how the canyon responded to their presence. Every step they took, every subtle shift in formation, every piece of equipment brushing against stone sent vibrations through the rock walls, the energy traveling upward and outward into layers of unstable terrain that had long since settled into a fragile balance. The canyon did not resist them in any obvious way, nor did it present an immediate threat, but it absorbed their movement, carried it, and redistributed it into places where even a slight disturbance could have consequences. The lead scout rounded the first bend, stepping into a darker section of the passage where the light diminished further and the walls pressed closer together, narrowing both movement and visibility. Their visor compensated instantly, adjusting to the lower light conditions as their sensors continued to sweep the path ahead. There was still nothing. No movement. No visible resistance. No indication that anything had changed. Behind them, one of the trailing scouts shifted their footing slightly as they adjusted position within the formation, their boot coming down just a fraction off rhythm as it caught against something thin and nearly invisible against the uneven ground. The cord tightened instantly under the sudden tension, and although the resistance it offered was minimal, it was enough to disrupt balance at precisely the wrong moment. The scout lurched forward, armor scraping sharply against stone as they stumbled into the unit ahead of them, and in a formation that relied on precision and spacing, even that small disruption began to ripple outward. Several soldiers collided in quick succession, their tightly packed advance working against them as the brief loss of control cascaded through the line. The resulting noise, a sharp metallic clatter followed by the grinding scrape of armor against rock, echoed through the canyon with unnatural intensity, rebounding off the walls and expanding into something far louder and more chaotic than the original disturbance. The lead scout turned immediately, raising a hand to steady the formation as their visor flared, attempting to isolate the source of the disruption and restore order. At that exact moment, the canyon responded. The fracture above them, already weakened and waiting, gave way under the accumulated stress, releasing a deep, violent crack that tore through the confined space as a section of the ledge collapsed. What followed was not a single falling object, but a cascading failure, as rock and debris broke loose and surged downward in a sudden avalanche that filled the narrow passage. There was no room to evade, no space to scatter, and no time to react in any coordinated way. The falling mass struck the formation with overwhelming force, slamming into armor, driving bodies into the canyon floor, and compressing the tightly packed units into one another. The impact reverberated through the stone, magnified by the confined space until the sound became a continuous thunder that rolled back and forth between the canyon walls. Dust and fragments of rock exploded outward, filling the air and reducing visibility to almost nothing as the force of the collapse settled into a suffocating haze of debris. When the movement finally subsided, the canyon fell into a heavy, oppressive silence, broken only by the faint shifting of loose stones and the low, disoriented movements of those who remained. Where the formation had once advanced with precision and confidence, there was now disorder. Spacing had collapsed. Several scouts were pinned beneath debris, their movements restricted or halted entirely, while others struggled to regain footing in an environment that no longer felt predictable or controlled. Their sensors, designed for clarity and precision, struggled to interpret the chaotic mix of dust, heat, and structural interference. The lead scout rose slowly, turning in place as their visor attempted to recalibrate and reestablish a clear picture of the situation. There was no visible enemy, no direct point of attack, no immediate explanation that fit within their expectations of engagement. Only the canyon itself and the damage it had inflicted. For the first time since entering the passage, their movement slowed, not from fear, but from a growing uncertainty that had not existed moments before. And within the narrow confines of the canyon, where control depended entirely on understanding the environment, that uncertainty marked the first shift in momentum, a subtle but critical change that would only grow as they continued forward. The canyon had not changed in any physical sense since the first collapse, yet the manner in which the enemy moved through it had altered so noticeably that it might as well have been an entirely different place. What had begun as a confident and tightly coordinated advance, driven by the certainty of superiority in numbers, had already begun to unravel into something more hesitant and fragmented, as the surviving elements of the formation attempted to restore order in the wake of a disruption they had not anticipated and could not immediately explain. Dust still lingered in the air from the earlier rockfall, suspended in slow drifting layers that caught the light filtering down through the canyon's upper edges, softening visibility and clinging to armor plating and sensor housings in a way that subtly degraded clarity without ever fully obstructing vision. The canyon walls themselves, which had previously functioned as nothing more than a restrictive geographical boundary, now seemed to impose a heavier psychological presence, as though the space itself had tightened in response to what had occurred within it, pressing inward in a way that encouraged caution and amplified perception of threat. High above, positioned along a natural ledge that blended seamlessly into fractured stone and shadow, Marcus remained motionless for a moment longer than strictly necessary. Not out of hesitation, but out of observation, allowing the enemy's altered behavior to fully reveal itself before committing to any further action. From this vantage point, he could already perceive the subtle but significant changes taking place within their movement patterns, as their once rigid formation expanded slightly, then contracted again, then expanded once more in response to uncertainty, each adjustment reflecting an attempt to reconcile what their systems were telling them with what their instincts were beginning to suspect. They were adapting, but not yet correctly. Communication bursts flickered between their helmets in tightly controlled intervals, brief pulses of data and command that attempted to impose structure upon uncertainty. Yet even without access to the content of those exchanges, Marcus could interpret their rhythm with ease. There was discipline within it, but also hesitation layered beneath that discipline, analysis competing with instinct, and a growing reluctance to accept that what had happened was either random or easily categorized. The enemy was no longer simply executing a pursuit. They were attempting to interpret a battlefield that was refusing to behave in accordance with their expectations. Marcus exhaled slowly as he adjusted his position against the rock, shifting his weight with deliberate care so as not to disturb the fragile balance of stone beneath him. The canyon offered more than just elevation and concealment. It offered structure, timing, acoustics, and misdirection, all of which could be shaped and layered into something far more complex than simple ambush tactics. Every movement within it carried consequences that echoed farther than the action itself, and every consequence could, in turn, be influenced by preparation that had already been set in motion. Below him, the enemy resumed their advance, though the change in their behavior was now unmistakable even from a distance. Their movement was slower, more deliberate, each step measured not only for speed but for risk, as their formation widened in an attempt to reduce vulnerability while simultaneously reducing cohesion. The adjustment was logical, even elegant in its reasoning, but it also introduced new weaknesses, as any spread in formation necessarily reduced the ability to respond collectively to sudden pressure from multiple angles. Marcus watched them pass through the section of canyon where the first collapse had occurred, their attention visibly heightened as they scanned the fractured rock and disturbed ground with increased scrutiny. Their pace decreased further as they navigated around scattered debris, careful not to trigger any secondary instability. And in doing so, they unknowingly allowed themselves to drift deeper into the most structurally compromised section of the entire route, a narrowing corridor where the canyon walls curved inward just enough to force a natural compression of movement, regardless of intent. It was precisely the kind of space that punished hesitation and amplified error. Marcus waited until the center of their formation entered that narrowing before initiating the next stage of his response. The action itself was not marked by spectacle or overt force, but rather by the controlled release of tension in a section of rock that had already been identified, prepared, and subtly weakened through earlier interference. The failure, when it came, did not manifest as a catastrophic explosion of force, but as a guided and directional shift in mass. A slab of stone peeling away from the upper ridge and sliding along the natural contour of the canyon wall, before intersecting the formation at an angle designed not to crush, but to disrupt. The impact forced immediate redistribution of movement within the enemy ranks, compressing their widened formation back inward as soldiers instinctively shifted to avoid the incoming mass, colliding with one another in the process and breaking the carefully established spacing they had only just managed to achieve. The canyon itself seemed to amplify every element of the disruption, carrying sound and vibration along its length in layered echoes that distorted perception and made individual events feel larger and more widespread than they physically were. What followed was no longer simple reaction. It was interpretation. For the first time, the enemy did not treat the event as an isolated accident or environmental coincidence. Their sensor arrays shifted focus away from the ground and toward the surrounding canyon walls, scanning for patterns, origins, or repeatable indicators that might explain the sequence of collapses they were experiencing. Their formation tightened again, but this time not out of confidence or control, but out of necessity, as they began to treat the canyon itself as an active variable within the engagement rather than a passive structure containing it. Marcus observed this shift with quiet recognition. They were learning, not correctly, but meaningfully. He adjusted his position once more, moving along the shadowed edge of the upper ledge with careful precision, keeping himself aligned with natural fractures in the stone that concealed both silhouette and motion. From here, he could already begin to see the next stage forming within their behavior, as uncertainty began to replace certainty, and analysis began to replace assumption. Every adjustment they made in response to the canyon only served to deepen their exposure to it, drawing them further into patterns of movement that he could anticipate and shape. And then below, the enemy commander issued a revised order that altered the entire tone of the engagement without ever acknowledging its true cause. The advance would continue, but with caution layered over doctrine, with structure layered over instinct, and with increasing emphasis placed on the possibility that the environment itself was no longer neutral. They did not yet articulate the thought fully, but it was forming regardless, that they were not simply advancing through hostile terrain. They were advancing through a space that did not behave as it should. And Marcus, watching from above as the canyon settled once more into a tense and uneasy stillness, understood that this belief, once fully formed, would become more dangerous to them than any physical trap he could construct. By the time the sun had climbed higher into the sky, the canyon had taken on a very different character in the minds of the advancing force. What had once been assessed as a narrow but manageable corridor of terrain had, through a sequence of increasingly difficult-to-explain incidents, begun to shift into something far less defined and far more unsettling. The environment itself no longer felt passive or predictable, and every attempt to impose order upon it seemed to generate only further contradiction. The earlier impacts had already achieved more than simple disruption. They had altered tempo, and in doing so, had changed expectation. The enemy was now moving with caution layered so heavily over doctrine that even basic coordination felt constrained, as though every decision required additional verification before it could be allowed to become action. That hesitation, subtle at first, had begun to accumulate across the formation until it affected not just movement speed, but perception itself. Marcus observed this from above with a quiet and deliberate focus, positioned along a fractured ridge where the canyon wall broke into overlapping layers of stone and shadow. From here, he could see not only their physical positions but the structure of their behavior, the way their spacing adjusted in response to unseen assumptions, the way their sensors swept patterns that suggested they were now actively searching for intent rather than simply detecting presence. They were no longer asking what had happened. They were beginning to ask what was doing it. That shift, more than any physical trap, was the point at which the canyon became something else entirely. Marcus adjusted his position with slow precision, moving laterally along the ridge until he reached a point where multiple sight lines converged on the canyon floor below. He did not need to dominate every section of the battlefield directly. Instead, he needed only to influence perception at key intervals, allowing the enemy's own analytical systems to fill in the gaps between events with increasingly incorrect assumptions. The next stage required less force than before, but significantly more timing. Below, the enemy formation had restructured itself again following the earlier disruption. The widening that had once been a tactical adaptation had now partially collapsed back into tighter groupings, as though the psychological comfort of proximity outweighed the tactical advantage of dispersion. Their movement was slower now, not simply due to caution, but due to the constant interruption of interpretation. Every few steps, portions of the formation would pause briefly, scanning the canyon walls, the upper ledges, and even the gaps between rock formations, as though expecting the terrain itself to reveal intent. Marcus waited until they passed into a section of canyon where visibility narrowed slightly due to overlapping rock formations. It was not a full choke point, but rather a subtle compression in visual range, enough to fragment perception without fully obstructing it. Within that ambiguity, he initiated the next phase. There was no single decisive action that defined it. Instead, there were multiple minor disturbances, carefully spaced and deliberately misaligned in origin. A brief movement of loose stone dislodged from one side of the canyon, followed moments later by a faint acoustic echo that suggested activity from a different direction entirely. Neither event was significant on its own, but together they created a pattern that implied multiple sources of motion, operating independently within the same confined space. The enemy reacted immediately, but not uniformly. One segment of the formation oriented toward the left ridge, while another shifted focus to the opposing wall, and a third attempted to maintain forward awareness, while simultaneously reconciling conflicting sensor data. Their communication channels became denser as overlapping reports of movement confirmation began to contradict one another, each unit insisting on detection validity from its own perspective, while failing to reconcile it with adjacent observations. Marcus did not need to add anything further at that moment. The canyon itself handled the amplification. Sound reflected in layered distortions, turning minor disturbances into ambiguous echoes that seemed to originate from multiple elevations at once. Shadows shifted subtly as clouds passed overhead, altering contrast just enough to create the impression of motion where none existed. Even the natural acoustics of the canyon began to work against the enemy's attempts at structured interpretation as delayed echoes returned out of sequence, reinforcing the illusion that activity was occurring simultaneously in multiple locations. Within minutes, the formation began to fracture in a way that was no longer purely tactical. It was perceptual. The enemy commander attempted to restore cohesion through stricter formation control, ordering tighter spacing and centralized focus on forward progression. But the instruction itself could not fully override what individual units were experiencing through their own sensor feeds. Reports of contact indicators continued to emerge from different sections of the canyon, none of which aligned spatially, but all of which were statistically plausible enough to prevent outright dismissal. And that, Marcus understood, was the critical threshold. Not certainty, plausibility. He shifted again, repositioning along the ridge to prepare for the next insertion point, moving with the kind of deliberate patience that did not belong to urgency, but to design. The canyon was now functioning as a layered system of suggestion, where each minor intervention reinforced the idea that they were not alone, and more importantly, that they could not determine how many separate threats were operating within the space around them. Below, the enemy formation slowed even further, not because they were losing capability, but because they were losing agreement. And in that widening gap between perception and consensus, Marcus allowed the next phase to begin forming naturally in their minds. The idea that they were no longer dealing with a single hostile presence operating from elevation and concealment, but with multiple coordinated units that they could neither locate nor fully track. And once that idea took hold, the canyon would no longer need to do the fighting for him. The enemy would begin doing it to themselves. As the afternoon progressed toward evening, the canyon began to shift in a way that was subtle enough to go unnoticed in any single moment, yet undeniable when viewed as a continuous sequence of evolving conditions. The light had softened further as the sun angled toward the ridgeline, stretching across the canyon floor in long, uneven bands that broke the terrain into alternating zones of brightness and shadow. These shifts were not dramatic on their own, but they continuously redefined depth perception, turning stable rock formations into visually ambiguous structures that appeared to change depending on angle, elevation, and momentary obstruction. What had once been a navigable corridor had gradually become an environment that resisted consistent interpretation. The enemy force continued its advance, but by this stage the word advance had become misleading. Their movement was no longer unified or decisively directed. Instead, it had fractured into a cautious, constantly reassessing progression where each unit was effectively negotiating its own understanding of the terrain in parallel with the others. The formation still existed physically, but its informational cohesion, the shared agreement on what was happening and where it was happening, had begun to degrade. Marcus observed from above without interruption, positioned along a fractured upper ridge where the canyon wall broke into layered outcrops of stone and shadow. From here, he could see not only the physical arrangement of the enemy force, but the divergence forming within it, the subtle but widening gaps between what individual units believed they were detecting and what adjacent units were reporting. This divergence was not yet obvious enough to be acknowledged as systemic failure, but it was accumulating in the background of every communication exchange. At ground level, the first signs of distortion were already being misinterpreted as contact. A minor shift of loose stone along a distant ridgeline was detected by one sensor cluster and immediately logged as movement. Moments later, a faint acoustic reflection, generated naturally by earlier activity, returned from a different angle and was interpreted by another unit as independent motion occurring in a separate location. Neither event was significant on its own, and under normal conditions they would have been dismissed as environmental noise. However, in combination with prior incidents, they now reinforced a pattern that was beginning to feel intentional, and intention, once assumed, altered every subsequent interpretation. Marcus did not need to increase activity. In fact, doing so would have risked collapsing the illusion prematurely. Instead, he relied on timing and separation, ensuring that natural environmental interactions were encountered at moments when the enemy was most likely to misattribute them. The canyon itself provided the necessary amplification. Its layered acoustics caused sound to reflect and return in delayed sequences, meaning that even a single disturbance could produce multiple perceived origins depending on position and timing. Shadows behaved in a similarly unreliable manner, especially as the sun dipped lower and passed behind uneven cloud cover, causing sections of the canyon to alternately brighten and dim in irregular patterns that suggested motion where none existed. At first, the enemy attempted to maintain strict discipline in interpretation. Reports were required to meet confirmation thresholds before engagement was authorized, and units were instructed to cross-reference detections before escalating responses. However, the problem they faced was not one of procedural failure. It was one of subjective experience. Each unit was operating within a slightly different version of the same environment, shaped by position, angle, timing, and prior expectation. As a result, what one unit identified as a probable contact zone did not align spatially with what another unit was simultaneously experiencing. This divergence created friction within the command structure almost immediately. A report from the left flank indicated movement along the upper western ridge, prompting a cautious scan and partial suppression fire into empty elevation. Almost simultaneously, a separate unit on the opposite side of the canyon reported motion at ground level near a fractured rock cluster, triggering a different response entirely. These two interpretations could not both be correct in a physically consistent sense, yet both were supported by sensor data that was individually plausible. The commander attempted to reconcile the discrepancy, issuing revised instructions that prioritized forward cohesion and restricted engagement to verified targets only. However, by this stage, verification itself had become unstable. Confirmation required agreement between systems that were no longer aligned in interpretation, and agreement was becoming increasingly rare. Marcus shifted slightly along his ridge position, not to intervene directly, but to maintain continuity of presence within the canyon's evolving perception structure. His role at this stage was no longer about generating events, but about ensuring that the space between events remained ambiguous enough to sustain misinterpretation. The canyon was now doing most of the work on its own, with each natural echo, each shifting shadow, and each delayed acoustic return, reinforcing the pattern that had already taken hold. As the formation moved deeper into the canyon, the discrepancies between reports began to escalate rather than resolve. One unit reported seeing movement at mid-elevation across multiple points simultaneously, while another insisted that ground-level activity was increasing in density ahead of the formation. Neither report could be conclusively disproven in real time, and both were treated as potential indicators of multiple hostile elements operating in coordination. That was the moment the interpretation changed qualitatively. The enemy no longer considered the possibility of a single concealed operator using terrain advantage. They began to consider the possibility of multiple coordinated units occupying separate vertical layers of the canyon simultaneously. This shift did not occur through a single decision. It emerged gradually through accumulation, reinforced by inconsistent sensor feedback and repeated partial confirmations of motion that never resolved into a singular source. Once this idea took hold, every subsequent anomaly reinforced it rather than challenging it. Fire became more distributed, less targeted, and increasingly speculative. Units began engaging potential threat vectors based on probability rather than certainty, directing controlled bursts toward ridges, shadows, and suspected movement zones that often overlapped with other units doing the same. The canyon, already rich in reflective acoustics, transformed each discharge into further distortion, as echoes returned from multiple surfaces and created the impression of return fire originating from positions that were never actually engaged. Communication channels became saturated not with panic, but with competing interpretations of the same reality. The commander's directives were still being issued clearly, but their effectiveness diminished with each passing minute, as they were filtered through increasingly inconsistent local perceptions. The structure of command remained intact in theory, but in practice it was being eroded by divergence in perception at the lowest operational level. Marcus observed this with a calmness that bordered on detachment, though it was in fact precise calculation. The canyon had now reached a state where it no longer required active manipulation to sustain the illusion. It had become self-reinforcing. Each reaction from the enemy contributed further to the instability, and each attempt to correct that instability only deepened it. And so, as the afternoon light continued to fade, and the canyon began its slow transition toward evening shadow, the enemy force arrived at a conclusion they had not been explicitly told, but could no longer avoid forming. They were no longer moving through a confined terrain under hostile interference. They were operating inside an environment that consistently produced evidence of multiple hostile presences without ever resolving them into a single source. And Marcus, watching from above as the canyon filled with increasingly misaligned acts of controlled fire and fractured perception, understood that the threshold had now been crossed. Not into confusion, but into constructed reality divergence. As evening began to settle over the canyon, the character of the battlefield shifted once again, not abruptly, but through a gradual deepening of shadow that crept down from the upper ridges and pooled within the lower ground like a slow-moving tide. The sun, now partially obscured by the uneven horizon of fractured stone and distant cliff formations, cast longer and more distorted silhouettes across the canyon floor, stretching shapes into unfamiliar proportions and dissolving the clarity that had still remained during the late afternoon phase. What had been uncertainty was now beginning to evolve into something more unstable, not confusion alone, but anticipation without clarity. The enemy formation, already strained by conflicting interpretations of the terrain, continued its advance with increasing hesitation. Their movement had slowed further, not due to resistance in the physical sense, but because every step now carried additional cognitive weight. Each unit was forced to reconcile its own sensor data against reports that no longer aligned reliably with adjacent positions, and the cumulative effect of this divergence was a gradual erosion of shared certainty. Marcus, however, was no longer constrained to still observation alone. With darkness beginning to soften the canyon's edges and reduce the reliability of visual tracking systems below, he moved with greater freedom than he had allowed himself during the daylight hours. The shadows that now filled the upper ridges and fractured ledges no longer worked against him in the same way they had earlier. Instead, They provided layered concealment that was both deeper and more forgiving, allowing him to traverse between positions with minimal risk of detection. More importantly, the shift in environmental conditions created opportunity, not just for misdirection, but for deliberate escalation. The equipment left behind by his own unit, previously intended for contingency delay and non-lethal disruption, now became something more flexible in his hands. Compact explosive charges, fragmentation devices, and smoke-based obscurants that had once been considered supplementary tools for extraction support were now being repurposed into a structured system of controlled battlefield denial. He did not deploy them randomly. Each placement followed a pattern shaped by earlier observation of enemy movement density, communication clustering, and the natural funnel points created by the canyon's geometry. Charges were positioned not simply to detonate, but to interact with structure, to convert the canyon itself into a secondary source of destructive force. Smoke devices were placed in intervals that aligned with wind flow through the canyon's upper channels, ensuring that when triggered, they would not merely obscure vision locally, but would drift unpredictably through multiple elevation layers. And beneath it all, timed charges were set with deliberate sequencing, not to create a single overwhelming moment of destruction, but to construct a rolling cascade of interruption that would force continuous reassessment within the enemy formation. Below him, the enemy continued their advance into the narrowing light. Their perception of the canyon had already fractured into multiple overlapping interpretations, but now those interpretations began to be tested in a far more immediate and physical way. The first detonation was not large enough to destroy the canyon, but it was precisely calibrated to alter its behavior. A controlled explosion along a mid-level ridge fractured a section of unstable stone, sending debris cascading downward into a narrow corridor of movement. The collapse was not total, but it was sufficient to split the formation's forward element from its rear support, creating a temporary separation that immediately disrupted command cohesion at a structural level rather than a perceptual one. Before that separation could fully stabilize, a second detonation triggered further along the canyon wall, this time not collapsing rock, but releasing a dense cloud of obscurant smoke that rapidly expanded into the airflow channels between ridge layers. Within moments, the canyon was no longer visually consistent across elevation. Upper units lost sight of lower movement entirely, while ground-level forces found their visibility compressed into short, unstable pockets of shifting gray. Communication degradation followed almost immediately, not due to system failure, but due to the inability to verify positional context. Reports of movement now lacked spatial anchors, meaning that even accurate observations could no longer be reliably placed within a shared map of understanding. And then, as the enemy attempted to reorient, a third and more violent detonation occurred deeper within the canyon structure. This one was not designed for isolation. It was designed for cascade response. The blast did not simply impact the surface. It interacted with previously weakened structural points, triggering a secondary collapse that rippled outward along natural fracture lines in the canyon wall. Stone shifted, fractured, and descended in segments that altered the internal geometry of the battlefield itself, forcing a sudden and involuntary compression of movement paths and severing line of sight between multiple operational groups. Now the canyon was no longer merely confusing, it was actively reshaping engagement conditions in real time. And within that newly fragmented structure, Marcus continued to move, not as a single point of interference, but as a distributed presence operating through timing, placement, and consequence. The enemy, already struggling to reconcile multiple contradictory reports of hostile activity, now found themselves facing something far more destabilizing. Not just the belief that they were engaging multiple squads, but the physical confirmation that wherever they attempted to regroup, the battlefield itself seemed to respond with calculated resistance. And as the smoke thickened and the echoes of collapse rolled through the canyon like delayed thunder, the final shift began to take hold in their collective assessment. This was no longer a pursuit. This was no longer a hostile terrain complication. This was an engagement zone that was actively punishing predictable movement. And Marcus, moving through the growing darkness above them, allowed the system he had built to begin operating without constant input. Because now, the canyon did not merely conceal him. It enforced his strategy. Night did not arrive in the canyon as a single definable moment, but rather as a progressive and uneven collapse of visibility that advanced in layers, beginning at the highest ridge lines where the last remnants of daylight were already fragmented by jagged stone formations, and then slowly descending into the canyon's interior, like a physical substance that seeped into every crevice and depression. The transition was not uniform, and because it was not uniform, it could not be reliably interpreted, leaving different sections of the battlefield operating under subtly different lighting conditions that changed not only what could be seen, but how distance and structure were perceived. What remained of daylight was no longer a stable reference point. It was an inconsistent variable. By this stage, the enemy force was no longer functioning as a single coherent operational unit in the informational sense, even though physically they still occupied the same canyon space. Instead, each segment of the formation had developed a localized interpretation of the battlefield constructed from its own sensor inputs, its own visual confirmations, and its own residual expectations formed during the earlier, more stable phases of engagement. These localized interpretations were not fully compatible with one another, and as time progressed, the differences between them widened rather than converged. This divergence created a phenomenon that command could not immediately resolve, reports that were individually accurate within their local context, yet globally incompatible when compared across the wider formation. A unit reporting movement along an upper ridge was not necessarily incorrect. A separate unit reporting movement at ground level in a different sector was also not necessarily incorrect. And yet, both could not be simultaneously true in a physically consistent model of the canyon. The problem was no longer detection. It was reconciliation. And reconciliation required a shared reality that was steadily eroding. Marcus moved above them through the deepening shadow with increasing freedom, no longer constrained by the strict discipline of stillness that had defined earlier phases of the engagement. The canyon, now layered in darkness, smoke residue, and shifting acoustic distortion, provided concealment through instability rather than obstruction. Movement itself became difficult to isolate unless directly observed at close range. And even then, confirmation required multiple converging factors that were no longer consistently available. From his elevated position, he no longer needed to act as a constant source of disruption. The system below was now sustaining itself. The first confirmed casualties of the night phase did not register as a singular, clearly defined event, but rather as fragmented confirmations that arrived through different channels at different times, each slightly misaligned in spatial or temporal reference. A forward element attempting to navigate a partially collapsed passage reported sudden loss of contact following structural failure, yet adjacent units initially misinterpreted residual sensor echoes as continued movement, delaying full recognition of what had actually occurred. By the time confirmation reached command, the event had already been reinterpreted multiple times, each layer of corrections slightly altering its perceived origin, scale, and location. And this distortion mattered more than the casualties themselves, because it prevented the formation of a stable understanding of cause. Elsewhere, another engagement cluster reported simultaneous movement signatures across multiple elevation layers, signatures that could not be reconciled into a single physical source. This resulted in engagement being distributed across multiple directions at once, each unit responding to its own localized interpretation of threat presence. When detonations followed, some initiated by Marcus, others triggered indirectly through structural instability already seeded earlier in the engagement, the resulting collapses created additional casualties that could not be cleanly attributed to a single cause, location, or sequence of events. The canyon itself had now become an active participant in this degradation. Smoke, still lingering from earlier detonations, no longer behaved as a uniform obscurant, but instead moved in layered flows dictated by uneven airflow channels carved through fractured rock. These flows created alternating pockets of visibility and blindness that shifted unpredictably as wind patterns interacted with temperature gradients across different elevations. As a result, a unit might visually confirm a clear path at one moment, only for that same path to become obscured or misleading moments later due to environmental drift. Sound compounded this instability. Acoustic reflections within the canyon no longer returned in consistent sequences. Instead, echoes arrived delayed, layered, and occasionally inverted in perceived direction, creating the impression of movement originating from locations that were physically inconsistent with the original source of disturbance. A single detonation or impact could therefore generate multiple perceived points of origin, depending entirely on the listener's position and the timing of environmental reflection. And within this system, every attempt to correct perception introduced new instability. Command attempted to restore coherence by increasing the strictness of engagement protocols, requiring higher confirmation thresholds before authorizing movement or fire. However, this introduced a secondary and equally dangerous effect: hesitation. Units now paused longer before acting, waiting for confirmation that often failed to converge in time, leaving them exposed within a dynamic environment that continued to evolve regardless of their decision latency. This hesitation did not remain neutral. It accumulated risk. Marcus, observing from above, adjusted his movement pattern not to increase disruption, but to align with expected hesitation intervals. His placements were no longer reactive in nature. They were anticipatory, positioned in relation to where uncertainty would force movement, rather than where movement currently existed. This marked a subtle but critical shift in the structure of the engagement. The battlefield was now being shaped not only by action and reaction, but by the predictable consequences of delayed decision-making. Below, this predictive pressure began to manifest in observable fragmentation. Some units advanced cautiously into areas that appeared clear within their immediate sensor range, but lacked corroboration from adjacent teams. Others, fearing unseen presence, began to engage preemptively into zones of statistical ambiguity, generating additional noise within the system that further degraded clarity. Each independent decision, while rational in isolation, contributed to a collective environment that became increasingly incoherent as a whole. Casualty reports followed the same pattern of degradation. A confirmed loss in one sector might be referenced moments later as occurring in a different elevation band or spatial zone, depending on which interpretation layer processed the data first. Entire engagement segments appeared to shift position retroactively within command overlays as new information recontextualized older inputs, creating a continuously rewriting operational map that no longer matched any stable physical reality on the ground. Even high-level command began to exhibit measurable hesitation. Orders were still being issued, but they were increasingly conditional, delayed, and structured around confirmation requests that could no longer be resolved with consistency. The command structure remained intact in form, but in function it was beginning to transition from directive authority to observational uncertainty, where leadership could no longer confidently distinguish between accurate reporting and environmental distortion. And beneath all of this, something more fundamental began to take hold within the force. Fear was no longer a reaction to enemy contact. It had become a response to uncertainty itself, because every action now carried the possibility of being based on incorrect interpretation, and every interpretation carried the possibility of being contradicted moments later by a different unit experiencing the same space under different conditions. Marcus continued to move through the darkness above them, placing final preparatory sequences with quiet precision, not as isolated acts of sabotage, but as structural confirmations of a system already in motion. The canyon no longer required constant intervention to maintain its effect. It had become self-reinforcing through the enemy's own attempts to stabilize what could no longer be stabilized. And as night deepened further, the force below reached a point that none of them could yet articulate within command channels, but all of them were now operating under implicitly. That they were no longer failing to engage a hidden opponent. They were failing to agree on what reality itself was allowing them to see. And in that failure, every decision became progressively indistinguishable from error. Long before the canyon had fully descended into its current state of fractured perception and competing interpretations of reality, Marcus had already begun laying in a secondary layer of control that none of the enemy force had yet fully accounted for. It did not begin as a dramatic act, nor even as a deliberate shift in strategy, but rather as an extension of necessity in the chaotic early withdrawal of his unit, when order had broken down just enough for useful things to be left behind in places that were not immediately recoverable. In the confusion of that initial retreat, when his company had been forced to abandon forward positions under pressure, several weapon systems had been left scattered across the canyon environment. Rifles, sidearms, and their associated ammunition were not destroyed or deliberately disabled, but instead simply lost in the urgency of movement, set down in sheltered recesses, wedged into temporary firing positions, or abandoned on ledges during rapid repositioning where carrying everything was no longer physically or tactically viable. At the time, these losses would have been logged as unfortunate but acceptable, the kind of attrition that accompanies any forced disengagement. But Marcus had not treated them as losses. He had treated them as potential that had simply been displaced in space. Over the following hours, before the enemy presence had fully solidified across the canyon, he had moved quietly through the terrain, retrieving what had been left behind, but not in any consolidated or predictable manner. There was no single cache, no centralized armament point that could be discovered and neutralized. Instead, each recovered weapon was deliberately repositioned into the canyon itself, placed not for storage, but for future use under conditions that had not yet fully formed. He selected positions with an almost architectural precision. High ledges where descent routes were limited and approach angles were narrow. Mid-level shelves of rock that provided both concealment and rapid disengagement paths. Transitional choke points where movement naturally slowed due to terrain compression, forcing any advancing force to expose themselves to observation or delay. Each position was chosen not only for what it allowed him to do, but for what it forced others to become while moving through it. And just as importantly, every position was selected with withdrawal in mind. Marcus never placed a weapon where he could not reach it quickly, use it briefly, and then disappear from the point of engagement without leaving a predictable trail of movement. The canyon, with its fractured geometry and layered depth, allowed this kind of distributed control architecture to exist without immediately revealing itself as such. What would have been obvious positioning in open terrain became indistinguishable here, where elevation shifts, shadow layering, and acoustic distortion all worked together to dissolve clear spatial logic. By the time night began to fully settle into the canyon, these dispersed caches were no longer simply stored equipment. They had become latent points of influence. Marcus did not rely on them continuously. In fact, their effectiveness depended on the opposite. Silence between their use was as important as the use itself, because it prevented the enemy from building any consistent predictive model around when or where ballistic contact might reappear. Instead, each deployment was treated as a single, isolated interruption in an already unstable system. A shot would come from above a zone that had already been marked as cleared. Another would originate from within terrain that had previously been assessed as structurally inaccessible. A third might emerge from a position that, according to enemy mapping, simply should not have contained any viable firing line at all. And each time it happened, it forced the same reaction cycle within the enemy formation: reassessment, contradiction, and delayed correction that often arrived too late to be useful. At first, these events were interpreted as anomalies. Then they became suspected oversights in reconnaissance. Then they began to be recorded as possible evidence of additional hostile presence operating independently of Marcus. That final interpretation was the most dangerous, because it introduced a completely new layer into their understanding of the battlefield. If Marcus was not alone, then the canyon did not contain a single adaptive adversary, but an organized structure operating beyond their detection capability. And if that were true, then every assumption about force size, positioning, and engagement probability had to be reconsidered under conditions of unknown scaling. But the truth, unknown to them, was far simpler and far more controlled. There was no second force. There was only Marcus and a terrain that he now understood more completely than anyone else present. Each weapon cache functioned as an extension of that understanding, not simply tools waiting to be used, but prepositioned corrections to enemy certainty, a way of injecting controlled violence into specific points of their reasoning process at exactly the moment that reasoning became most vulnerable to disruption. The canyon itself amplified this effect. Sound did not travel cleanly, but instead fractured into delayed echoes that often arrived out of sequence with visual confirmation. A shot fired from one location might be perceived as originating from 2 or even 3 different directions depending on elevation and timing of reflection. This meant that even when a unit believed it had identified the source of fire, that conclusion was already contaminated by competing acoustic interpretations. And Marcus moved between these points with a calm efficiency that was no longer defined by concealment alone, but by timing. He no longer needed to remain hidden in the traditional sense. Instead, he only needed to remain unpredictable in relation to when each cache would become active. A single engagement burst from one position would often be followed by immediate silence, long before any return fire could be meaningfully directed. By the time enemy units attempted to respond, Marcus would already be elsewhere, and the firing position would have returned to being indistinguishable from every other silent feature of the canyon. What made this phase particularly destabilizing was not the frequency of these events, but their irregularity. There was no rhythm to exploit, no pattern to anticipate, no escalation curve that could be mapped in real time. Each instance stood alone, yet cumulatively they created a persistent suggestion that the canyon itself could produce violence from anywhere, at any moment, without warning and without visible preparation. And as this idea took hold, something subtle but critical began to shift within the enemy formation. They stopped treating silence as absence of threat. They began treating it as concealment of threat. And once that threshold was crossed, every section of terrain became equally suspect, regardless of prior clearance or confirmed stability. Marcus, moving above it all, did not need to accelerate the collapse. He only needed to ensure that certainty never had enough time to rebuild itself. As night tightened its grip on the canyon, the enemy force reached a stage of operational confusion that could no longer be attributed to isolated reporting errors or intermittent environmental distortion. What had begun as sporadic inconsistencies in spatial awareness had, by this point, evolved into a systemic failure in how the battlefield itself was being mentally structured. The core assumption that had sustained their advance, that contact would originate ahead of movement and diminish behind it, was no longer holding under sustained pressure. It was not that the assumption had been formally rejected or replaced by a new doctrine. It was more unsettling than that. It was still being used, still being relied upon, even as evidence accumulated that it was no longer consistently true, and that dissonance created hesitation. Marcus had begun exploiting that hesitation with increasing precision. He was no longer moving in a way that respected the enemy's expectation of directional continuity. Instead, he moved through the canyon in a pattern that repeatedly crossed back through previously traversed space, but never in a way that formed a loop or predictable cycle. There was no retracing of steps, no repetition of pathing that could be extrapolated into a model. Each return into an already cleared zone was approached from a different elevation, a different angle of descent or ascent, and at a different temporal distance from the enemy's passage through that same space. This meant that behind was no longer a stable condition. It was a temporary misunderstanding. A section of canyon that had been deemed secure minutes earlier could, without any visible transition, become an active engagement zone again. Not because Marcus was following them in a linear pursuit, but because he was re-entering the system at points that had been mentally archived as resolved. The first time this occurred, it was dismissed as a delay in reporting. A unit moving through a narrow transitional corridor reported contact from a direction that contradicted their own advance path. Command initially attributed this to acoustic distortion or misaligned sensor interpretation, assuming that the engagement had originated from further ahead and been misclassified due to echo delay. But then it happened again, and again. Each instance carried a similar structure. A unit would pass through terrain without resistance, continue forward under the assumption of clearance, and then receive contact reports originating from that same space moments later, as if the canyon had reactivated behind them. The psychological impact of this pattern was subtle at first, because it did not immediately present as contradiction. It presented as delay, as though the canyon itself was simply slower to reveal threats than expected. But as more reports accumulated, the delay theory became increasingly difficult to sustain, because the frequency of rear re-engagement events began to exceed the plausible limits of delayed detection. Marcus was not simply attacking from behind. He was inserting contact into zones that had already been mentally closed off by the enemy's own progression. This distinction mattered, because once a space had been passed without resistance, it was no longer actively monitored with the same cognitive intensity as forward-facing sectors. Attention shifted forward by necessity. That shift created blind intervals, not physical blindness, but interpretive neglect. Marcus exploited those intervals with precise efficiency, reintroducing controlled violence into areas that the enemy had already downgraded in threat priority. A single suppressed discharge from a cached rifle positioned along a mid-level ledge would be enough to fracture that assumption again, not because of the damage inflicted, but because of the location from which it originated. A sidearm shot from a recess above a previously cleared passage would do the same, especially when that passage had already been confirmed as stable by multiple overlapping units. Each event forced a recalibration that could not complete cleanly, because recalibration required a stable reference model, and the model itself was no longer stable. What made this increasingly corrosive was the way these incidents began to overlap with ongoing forward engagements. A unit engaged in what they believed to be a frontal contact would simultaneously receive reports of rear activity, sometimes within the same time window, sometimes from adjacent units, and sometimes from within their own previously cleared sectors. This created a breakdown not in communication, but in spatial trust. Units began to question whether their understanding of behind was still valid in any meaningful sense. Rear elements started requesting confirmation of safety in areas that forward elements had already passed through without issue. Forward elements, in turn, began slowing their advance not because of immediate threat, but because they could no longer assume that cleared terrain remained cleared. And this hesitation propagated upward through command structure in a way that was increasingly difficult to suppress, because command was still attempting to interpret the canyon as a linear engagement space with definable sectors of control. But the reports they were receiving no longer supported that structure. Instead, they described a battlefield where contact could re-emerge in any previously traversed location without warning, as though the canyon itself retained memory of their passage and chose specific moments to invalidate it. Marcus did not need to increase the frequency of these events. He only needed to ensure that no cleared space remained consistently clear long enough to be treated as reliable. The cached weapons made this possible, but his movement pattern made it unavoidable. Each return to a previously passed zone was not a pursuit of enemy units, but a redefinition of what safe passage meant within the canyon. A rifle fired once into a space that had already been cleared did not simply create disruption. It retroactively contaminated the certainty of that clearance. And once that certainty began to degrade, it did not degrade evenly. It fractured. Some units began treating all rear zones as potentially active regardless of confirmation. Others began refusing to fully commit forward until rear sectors had been revalidated, creating a delay loop where neither direction could be fully trusted at the same time. The formation began to lose its ability to distinguish progression from exposure. Marcus, moving through this collapsing structure, no longer appeared as a force advancing against them. He appeared as something far more destabilizing to their analysis systems. A variable that could reappear in any space they had already psychologically filed away as resolved. And in that condition, even movement itself stopped being a measure of control. It became a liability. As Marcus's influence over the canyon deepened, his use of the cached weapons evolved beyond simple disruption or positional denial. The pattern of engagement began to shift in a way that was no longer defined solely by lethality, but by intent that could not be consistently interpreted by those on the receiving end. Some shots were not designed to kill at all. They were designed to interrupt certainty. A round might crack past a unit's position without impact, close enough to register unmistakably as deliberate fire, yet distant enough to deny immediate confirmation of targeting intent. These near misses were not random. They were placed with precision, timed to pass through the narrow window of perception where the brain could register threat without resolving it into action or origin. The effect was not physical damage, but cognitive disruption. The sudden awareness that a firing solution existed somewhere in the environment without any stable indication of where it had originated, or why that specific moment had been chosen. Other shots carried a different purpose entirely. Instead of avoidance, they were directed into the structure of movement itself. Impacts to shoulder joints, elbow lines, and the back of knee articulation points created injuries that did not immediately remove a unit from the field, but instead degraded their ability to move, aim, or maintain coordinated posture under pressure. These were not clean eliminations. They were functional reductions. Affected individuals remained conscious, often still capable of communication, but their presence in the formation became mechanically destabilizing. Every injured soldier now introduced additional noise into the system: delayed movement, altered gait, inconsistent response timing, all of which compounded the already fragile interpretation of spatial reliability within their surrounding units. And then there were the direct eliminations. Not frequent enough to form a predictable ratio, but precise enough that their absence was just as psychologically significant as their occurrence. Certain individuals, often those positioned at points of heightened awareness or communication responsibility, would be removed from the system entirely in moments that offered no opportunity for pattern recognition. A shot from an unseen elevation, a brief interruption in acoustic continuity, and then silence where a coordinating voice had been. The result of this variability was not simply physical attrition. It was interpretive instability, because the enemy could no longer confidently classify incoming fire as belonging to a single behavioral category. Every engagement carried ambiguity of intent. Was this a warning shot, a disabling strike, a targeted removal, or an attempt to deliberately manipulate their movement through fear rather than force? That uncertainty began to erode the internal consistency of their responses. Units under fire could no longer reliably predict whether evasive action would reduce risk or increase exposure. A missed shot might indicate inaccuracy, or it might indicate restraint. A disabling injury might suggest tactical suppression, or it might suggest deliberate selective degradation of mobility. A lethal strike might be interpreted as necessity, or as psychological punctuation in an otherwise non-lethal sequence. Marcus never clarified these distinctions, and because he never clarified them, the canyon began to define them on his behalf. Each cache position became a potential source of any of these outcomes, and each engagement reinforced the idea that the type of response was not dictated by enemy behavior, but by something far less stable: Marcus's interpretation of the moment itself. This created a new and more corrosive layer within enemy psychology. They were no longer only reacting to an unseen adversary. They were reacting to the possibility that every shot carried a different meaning they could not decode in real time, and that meant even successful survival no longer resolved uncertainty. It only postponed it. Marcus, moving through the canyon's layered darkness, did not need to increase the volume of fire to maintain this effect. In fact, restraint was often more effective than escalation. A sequence of near misses followed by a single disabling strike could destabilize an entire cluster more effectively than sustained engagement, because it forced constant reevaluation of what level of threat response was appropriate in the absence of clear classification rules. And as this pattern continued, something subtle but critical began to shift within the formation. They stopped asking where the next shot would come from, and started asking what it was supposed to mean when it arrived. As Marcus's pattern of controlled engagement continued to evolve within the canyon's fractured darkness, a new and deeply destabilizing behavior began to emerge within the enemy formation. one that command did not immediately authorize, and in some cases did not immediately become aware of until it had already begun to spread. Units were starting to withdraw, not as part of a coordinated tactical redeployment, not under structured command direction, but as isolated, locally rational decisions made under conditions of sustained uncertainty, where the perceived cost of remaining in position began to outweigh the perceived benefit of holding formation integrity. At first, these withdrawals were subtle enough to be dismissed as repositioning, a unit falling back from a contested corridor after sustaining injury, a forward element pausing and then drifting rearward under the assumption that contact density had increased beyond acceptable thresholds. Each instance taken individually could be justified within standard operational flexibility, but they did not remain individual, because the canyon did not allow them to remain isolated. Every withdrawal created a spatial gap, and every spatial gap created a new zone of interpretive instability for adjacent units, who now had to reconcile why a previously held position had suddenly become untenable without any clear escalation in visible threat. That uncertainty did not remain contained. It propagated outward, altering perception of risk not only in the withdrawn sector, but in surrounding sectors that now had to account for the possibility that stability itself was no longer reliable. Marcus observed this shift without needing to accelerate it. In fact, he did not need to directly engage withdrawing units at all. Their movement alone was sufficient to degrade the structural cohesion of the formation, because in a linear battlefield model, withdrawal is supposed to be controlled, communicated, and reinforced by adjacent support. When that structure fails, withdrawal stops being a tactical adjustment and becomes a signal of systemic instability. And once that signal begins to spread, it is very difficult to contain. Some units began retreating without confirmation from command, prioritizing immediate survival over operational continuity. Others hesitated mid-movement, caught between conflicting impulses, to hold position as ordered or to fall back in response to the apparent collapse of neighboring elements. That hesitation, more than the withdrawal itself, became the most dangerous factor because it introduced inconsistency into what had previously been a unified behavioral model. Command attempts to reassert control began to arrive into an environment that was already reacting faster than instructions could propagate. Orders to hold were issued into sectors where units were already in motion. Requests for confirmation of status returned delayed, fragmented or contradicted by other units occupying the same informational layer. In some cases, command received reports that positions were still secure moments after receiving simultaneous reports that those same positions were no longer occupied. And within that contradiction, authority itself began to lose its weight, because authority depends not only on issuance, but on perceived alignment with reality. Marcus did not need to target command structures directly for this effect to occur. The canyon itself, shaped and seeded through earlier phases of disruption, was already amplifying divergence between observation and interpretation. Every delayed confirmation, every misaligned report, every inconsistent casualty or contact signature contributed to a growing sense that the formation was no longer operating within a single shared understanding of the battlefield. Withdrawals accelerated as a result, not because they were ordered, but because they were not prevented effectively enough to remain exceptional. And once withdrawal becomes visible without consequence or correction, it ceases to be an anomaly. It becomes an option.
Marcus's cached weapon positions now interacted with this behavior in a far more destabilizing way. A retreating unit might pass through a zone previously considered cleared, only to trigger a delayed engagement from a position they had already traversed earlier in the advance. Another might withdraw along a different route and encounter contact originating from what they believed to be their rear security corridor. These events did not need to be frequent. They only needed to occur at the exact moments when confidence in safe withdrawal routes was beginning to form. And each time they did, they reinforced the same conclusion within the withdrawing elements. There is no direction that guarantees safety anymore. Not forward, not behind, not even where they had already been. This created a self-reinforcing loop of instability because withdrawal, once initiated, required predictable safe corridors to remain sustainable. Without those corridors, retreat becomes indistinguishable from exposure. and exposure under conditions of uncertain engagement origin becomes indistinguishable from ongoing combat. So even retreat began to lose its meaning. Units that withdrew too early risked isolation. Units that held too long risked entrapment. Units that moved without coordination risked re-entering zones of intermittent engagement that could activate without warning or pattern. Marcus did not need to accelerate this collapse. He only needed to ensure that every possible decision space, forward, lateral, or rearward, remained intermittently unsafe in ways that could not be reliably predicted or avoided. And as the canyon deepened around them, something fundamental began to fail within the enemy formation. They were no longer simply losing control of territory. They were losing control of the idea that movement itself could resolve uncertainty. And in that condition, even discipline stops functioning as a stabilizing force. It becomes just another opinion competing with fear. By the time the enemy formation attempted to reassert even a minimal level of structural coherence, the canyon was already no longer behaving as a passive environment shaped by individual acts of disruption. It had become something far more immediate and far less forgiving, a layered system of potential contact points that no longer activated in isolation, but in response to the accumulation of pressure across multiple elevations and time offsets. Marcus did not initiate the next phase as a single decisive action. He initiated it as a sequence, not rapid enough to be perceived as a continuous barrage and not slow enough to be separated into unrelated incidents. Instead, it unfolded in staggered intervals that crossed the canyon's vertical structure in a way that ensured no single unit, no single corridor, and no single command layer could observe the full pattern as it emerged. A shot would break the silence from a high ledge long abandoned by forward movement, precisely timed to coincide with a moment when enemy attention was committed elsewhere. Then, before that engagement could be fully processed, another discharge would occur from a mid-level recess along a previously cleared route, forcing immediate reinterpretation of spatial security. Shortly after that, a third would originate from a lower transitional channel that had already been traversed multiple times without incident, collapsing any remaining confidence in the reliability of safe passage. Each event on its own was manageable. Together, they were not, because they did not arrive as a single front. They arrived as overlapping contradictions. Enemy units attempting to respond found themselves forced into incompatible directions of attention. Forward elements were reacting to rear origin contact reports. Rear elements were reporting engagement from spaces that forward elements insisted had already been cleared. Mid-formation units were receiving conflicting instructions depending on which engagement report reached them first, and each delay in reconciliation created further divergence in response timing. And beneath this growing fragmentation, something more fundamental began to fail. The canyon was no longer being interpreted as a space containing an enemy. It was being interpreted as a space generating multiple simultaneous enemies without consistent origin points. This was the moment Command attempted to reclassify the situation. What had initially been understood as a single hostile presence operating within complex terrain was now being reassessed, rapidly and with increasing urgency, as the possible presence of multiple coordinated elements operating in overlapping elevation strata. The logic was not entirely unfounded from their perspective. The distribution of contact points, the apparent simultaneity of engagement across different sectors, and the continued reappearance of fire from previously cleared zones all suggested a level of coordination that exceeded what a single operator should reasonably sustain. But the problem was that this conclusion, while logical under their corrupted data set, was also incorrect. There were not multiple squads. There was only one source of continuity within the canyon, and that continuity did not obey the same constraints as their interpretation of movement. Marcus moved through the system not as a point of pressure, but as a coordinating absence, appearing only briefly within the window of each cache activation, then disappearing again before the enemy could stabilize either direction or intent. The caches themselves were no longer just static resources. They had become distributed ignition points within a broader pattern of engagement that no longer respected linear sequencing. As the cascade continued, withdrawal routes began to collapse in real time under their own uncertainty. A unit attempting to fall back along a previously safe corridor would trigger engagement from a position that had been silent minutes earlier. Another attempting lateral repositioning would encounter contact emerging from terrain that had already been traversed and cleared. Even forward movement, once considered the default axis of survival, now carried the same risk of intermittent activation as every other direction. There was no longer a safer choice, only different forms of exposure, and because exposure could no longer be predicted with confidence, movement itself began to slow across the formation, not as a coordinated halt, but as a distributed hesitation that spread unevenly through different segments of the canyon, creating pockets of stagnation separated by sudden reactive bursts of motion that only further destabilized cohesion. Command attempted to regain control by issuing structured reorganization orders, attempting to redefine sectors, reassign contact responsibility, and reestablish a coherent front line. But these instructions were received into a system that could no longer guarantee spatial consistency between sender and receiver. In some cases, units were ordered to hold positions they no longer occupied. In others, they were instructed to withdraw along routes that had already become intermittently unsafe moments earlier. And as these contradictions accumulated, the final stabilizing assumption began to erode entirely, that the battlefield could still be mapped in real time. Marcus did not need to increase pressure beyond this point. The cascade was now self-sustaining. Every engagement event created the conditions for the next misinterpretation. Every misinterpretation created hesitation. Every hesitation created exposure, and every exposure created new engagement opportunities that fed directly back into the same cycle without requiring further initiation from a single central actor. The canyon, in effect, had begun to simulate multiplicity where none existed, and the enemy force, still attempting to operate under the assumption of singular adversarial control, was now reacting to a battlefield that no longer matched any model they could confidently reconstruct. Not because it had changed into something new, but because it had become too inconsistent to define as one thing at all. And somewhere within that collapsing structure, Marcus continued to move, quietly, intermittently, never long enough to be pinned to any single point of origin, only long enough to ensure the next contradiction arrived on time. By the time the cascade of staggered engagement points had fully taken hold across the canyon's layered structure, the enemy formation was no longer operating under conditions that could be meaningfully described as controlled maneuver. What remained of its cohesion existed only in isolated pockets, separated by increasing gaps of uncertainty where communication, confirmation, and spatial agreement were no longer reliably aligned. And within those gaps, something else began to emerge, not withdrawal in any structured sense, not redeployment under pressure, but flight.
Units that had once attempted controlled fallback under partial command direction began abandoning those patterns entirely. The distinction between tactical retreat and instinctive escape collapsed under sustained exposure to unpredictable engagement origin points. Movement was no longer being selected based on optimal routes or coordinated withdrawal corridors. Instead, it was being driven by immediate proximity to perceived threat, regardless of whether that threat was real, delayed, misinterpreted, or entirely residual. Soldiers ran, not in formation, not in alignment with adjacent units, but as fragmented individuals breaking away from the collective structure entirely, often in different directions, often without shared destination, and often directly into areas that had not been cleared, rescanned, or confirmed as safe in any meaningful sense. And every instance of that uncontrolled movement generated new contradictions within command interpretation. Because from above, from within the remaining structured command perspective, those units were still part of an organized battalion. Their movements still needed to be categorized as intentional. Their deviations still needed to be rationalized within an operational framework that assumed discipline remained intact. But what was being reported no longer matched that assumption in any coherent way. Reports of units withdrawing under pressure were followed seconds later by confirmation that those same units had broken formation entirely. Requests for status updates returned either fragmented responses or no responses at all,
not because communication had fully failed, but because the recipients were no longer remaining in positions long enough for structured reporting to occur. Marcus did not need to pursue these fleeing elements. Their own movement ensured exposure. The canyon, already destabilized through layered engagement and cached weapon activation points, now punished uncontrolled movement with the same intermittent unpredictability that had previously targeted structured formation. A unit running through a corridor that had been traversed minutes earlier might suddenly encounter contact from a position that had remained silent throughout the preceding sequence. Another attempting to escape along a lower channel would trigger delayed fire from an elevated cache position that had not yet been activated during that specific interval of the cascade. And because there was no longer any reliable way to distinguish between safe passage and latent threat, the act of running itself became indistinguishable from risk amplification. Command attempted to restore discipline through voice, through protocol, through reassertion of control channels that had previously governed movement integrity. But those directives now arrived into a formation that no longer shared a consistent understanding of where it was, what it occupied, or what direction could be trusted as either forward or rearward. In some cases, orders were received by units already in uncontrolled retreat, their movement so rapid and so disconnected from formation structure that instructions could no longer meaningfully intercept behavior in time to alter it. In others, orders were never received at all, not due to communication failure, but because the units themselves had already dispersed beyond any coherent tracking radius within the canyon's fractured topology. And within command analysis, a far more destabilizing conclusion began to take shape. The battlefield no longer resembled a structured engagement zone containing hostile contact. It resembled a collapsing system in which organized units were being progressively stripped of cohesion by exposure to an environment that refused to remain static long enough to be mapped. Marcus, moving through the upper layers of that same environment, observed the transition without needing to accelerate it further. The caches had already fulfilled their structural role. The canyon no longer required active orchestration to maintain disruption. Each uncontrolled retreat, each fragmented movement, each misaligned engagement report fed back into the same cycle of uncertainty that now sustained itself without external reinforcement. And so the final distinction between retreat and collapse disappeared entirely. What remained was motion without coordination, reaction without structure, survival without direction. And in that state, even the idea of a battalion ceased to hold its original meaning, because there was no longer a unified force to retreat. Only individuals running through a canyon that no longer behaved like terrain, but like consequence. By the time the enemy formation had fully fractured into scattered movement and uncoordinated flight, what remained of their operational structure existed only in fragments of interpretation held together by habit rather than certainty. Communication still functioned in a technical sense, but it no longer functioned in a meaningful one. Messages were still being sent, still being received, still being logged, but they no longer described the same battlefield across the force, and that divergence had now reached its final stage. Marcus did not introduce a new pattern. He removed the need for a single one. The caches, distributed across the canyon's vertical layers, high ledges, mid-tier recesses, lower channels that had already been passed and repassed under shifting conditions of fear and confusion, were no longer treated as isolated tools. They were treated as a network of dormant triggers that had already been proven active in unpredictable sequence. And now, for the first time since the engagement began, they activated in coordination, not as a continuous barrage, not as a sustained exchange, but as a staggered convergence of contact points that unfolded across elevation bands in such a way that no single observer, no single unit, and no single command layer could reconstruct the full sequence in real time. A discharge from a high position would cut through the canyon's upper darkness, its origin masked by shadow layering and acoustic distortion. Moments later, a second engagement would erupt from a mid-level position that had been previously classified as cleared and non-viable for sustained contact. Then, before either of those could be fully processed, a third would emerge from a lower transition corridor, one that fleeing units were actively moving through at the exact moment of activation. Each individual event was survivable in isolation, But they were no longer isolated. They were overlapping. And because they overlapped across vertical space, they destroyed the last remaining assumption the enemy had relied upon, that threats could be separated by direction. Forward, rear, flank, and elevation ceased to function as reliable categories. Everything became simultaneous. Everything became uncertain. Units attempting to retreat found themselves caught between conflicting interpretations of safe movement corridors. Those moving upward into higher terrain triggered engagement from positions that had been silent only moments before. Those descending into lower channels encountered fire from caches that had not previously been active during their earlier passage. Even stationary units, those attempting to hold position and await confirmation, were no longer insulated because silence itself no longer guaranteed absence of activation. And within command structure, the final collapse of interpretive cohesion began to take hold. Reports of contact were no longer reconcilable as belonging to a single hostile actor operating across complex terrain. The density, distribution, and simultaneity of engagements exceeded the thresholds required for single-source classification. What was being observed, from their perspective, could only be explained by the presence of multiple coordinated hostile elements operating across different elevation strata and communication blind zones. The conclusion was not correct, but it was the only conclusion that still fit the data without requiring the acceptance that the data itself could no longer be trusted. And so it was adopted. Officially, the engagement was no longer classified as contact with a single hostile operator. It was reclassified as a multi-element engagement within a fractured canyon network. And with that reclassification, the final remaining attempt at unified control was issued. A withdrawal order, total disengagement, full extraction protocol. But by the time it propagated through what remained of the formation, it arrived into a system that no longer shared a stable understanding of where units were, what direction they were facing, or whether adjacent elements still existed in coordinated proximity. Some units never received the order at all, having already dispersed into uncontrolled retreat through terrain that no longer supported structured movement. Others received it too late, the instruction arriving after they had already re-entered zones of intermittent activation, where cached positions were already cycling through their final staggered sequence, and some received it cleanly, clearly, and in full, but could no longer act on it with confidence that withdrawal itself would not trigger further exposure. Marcus did not accelerate the final phase. He did not need to. The canyon had already been conditioned to respond. Each cache, each elevation layer, each previously established position of controlled fire now contributed to a final synchronized illusion of multiplicity. Not because multiple forces existed, but because no single observer could remain positioned long enough to disprove that assumption. To the enemy, it became indistinguishable from coordinated company-level engagement across the entire canyon system. To command, it became indistinguishable from a full battlefield saturation event involving multiple hostile elements. And to those still moving within it, it became something simpler and far more immediate, a place where no direction guaranteed survival long enough to justify choosing it. Above it all, Marcus moved through the upper darkness one final time, not pursuing, not chasing, not even advancing in any traditional sense of the word. He was simply transitioning between the last remaining points of influence, confirming that each layer of the canyon's prepared structure had completed its intended function. Below him, the formation ceased to behave as a formation at all. It dissolved into isolated motion, and then into uncertainty. And finally, into silence that no longer represented absence of conflict, but absence of any shared understanding of where conflict had ever been in the first place. Morning did not arrive gently in the canyon. It arrived with silence. The first human squad to return expected a contested zone, or at the very least residual resistance pockets that would require caution, scanning sweeps, and slow tactical re-entry. What they found instead forced them to halt almost immediately upon visual confirmation of the terrain. The canyon had changed, not subtly, not gradually, but in a way that made prior maps feel obsolete. Entire sections of the rock face had collapsed inward, as though the terrain itself had buckled under sustained stress. Narrow corridors that once allowed controlled movement were now blocked by fallen stone and fractured overhangs. Mid-level ledges had been torn open, exposing jagged new sightlines where none had existed before. In some places, the canyon had widened unnaturally, reshaped by repeated structural failures that suggested not a single point of destruction, but a sequence of cascading failures across multiple elevations. And scattered throughout it all, remnants, hundreds of enemy casualties. Some clearly taken by direct fire and exposed movement. Others caught in collapse zones where stone and debris had become as lethal as any weapon. And others still, reduced by explosive force in confined spaces where there had been no room to absorb the impact. There was no front line, no defensive perimeter, no recognizable engagement boundary, just the aftermath of a space that had stopped behaving like terrain and started behaving like a system that had been forced to fail repeatedly until nothing coherent remained. At the center of it all, Marcus was found. Alive. Seated in a position that suggested he had simply run out of energy before he had run out of control over the situation. Exhausted beyond immediate articulation, but intact. Injuries present, but not critical. Signs of sustained stress and prolonged cognitive strain were obvious even before medical assessment confirmed battle fatigue and acute operational exhaustion. He did not resist extraction. He did not exaggerate what had occurred. He simply described it in measured terms as if it had been a sequence of necessary actions rather than anything approaching extraordinary survival. Medical teams stabilized him. Command personnel arrived soon after, and then came the report. What followed was not disbelief in the sense of denial, but disbelief in the sense of scale. The recorded data from intercepted enemy communications confirmed multiple simultaneous distress transmissions, fragmented command overrides, and repeated misidentification of force strength. What the enemy had believed to be a multi-company ambush operating across the canyon's full vertical depth had, in reality, been the result of a single coordinated operator working within a pre-prepared terrain system. The canyon, in enemy communications logs recovered later that day, had already been given a designation, not a grid reference, not a tactical identifier, but a name, a warning, a label repeated across broken transmissions, corrupted reports, and emergency withdrawals that had never fully stabilized into organized retreat, killing zone. The designation stuck. Within human command structure, the engagement was no longer recorded as a standard defensive action. It was recorded as an extreme terrain denial event, executed under improvised conditions by a single cadet-level operator. The after-action report, when fully compiled, was met with extended silence at senior review level. Not because the facts were unclear, but because the implications were unusually clear. A full analysis of the canyon suggested that, under standard doctrine, the position should have been indefensible. Marcus had not defended it. He had transformed it. Recognition followed, though not immediately in ceremony. First came evaluation, then reclassification, then reassignment review. And only after that did the decision settle into place. Promotion was confirmed, distinction awarded, and an additional directive issued quietly within training command structures. Marcus would not return immediately to frontline deployment cycles. Instead, he would be assigned to instruction and tactical development, specifically focused on irregular terrain engagement, adaptive survival under resource scarcity, and psychological disruption warfare in non-linear environments. Because what he had demonstrated was not simply endurance, it was methodology. And in the final analysis, that canyon was no longer just a battlefield that had been survived. It had become a reference point, a case study, a warning, and a lesson